Dear Bethany, Happy New Year. It's belated.
Happy New Year.
Yeah, we didn't talk for 7, 8 months, and this time we're not going to discuss his ban and topics that we covered in previous conversations. We're shifting our focus westward. We're shifting the focus towards the Mediterranean coast. And can you tell something more about this transition between Mamluk economy and Ottoman economy? You studied the site Khirbet Beit Mazmil, and can you tell more about the location of the site?
Yeah, Khirbet Beit Mazmil is a very, very small farmstead. It's a walled farmstead on one of the highest hills of modern Jerusalem. So it's located basically mid-distance between the old city of Jerusalem and the village of Ein Kedem. And even people who live in the neighborhood, that neighborhood of Jerusalem, really never knew it was there until we started excavating there in 2015. Um, it was obscured by garbage. It was obscured by a very heavily overgrown orchard that was still producing almonds and that used to have roses and pomegranates as well. So it was a secret hidden garden in the city of Jerusalem, and a really fine place to be able to do archaeological field work for 5 seasons, which we did from 2015 to 19. Um, the site dates from the Mamluk period through the entirety of the Ottoman period until 1927, when the farmstead was destroyed by an earthquake, and then it was abandoned, and its ruins were terraced as an orchard, which is kind of a beautiful end to the history of the occupation of a place. When you die and you end up a garden, I think that's a lovely story. Um, What's fascinating about the place is that it is one of the few sites in the region where we can actually study the transition between the Mamluk and Ottoman periods. And while we do have some breaks in occupation, it's more or less steadily occupied from the 13th until the early 20th century. And during that time, we can see how one single household and one single farmstead changes and adapts and renews itself in relation to the changing political environment and economic opportunities of the day. So what starts off as a military estate in the 14th century becomes just a common family farmstead from the late 16th century on. And that family farmstead evolves as the local economy evolves, and the people that live there become more and more engaged in market agriculture. And it's fascinating to see how that place and the people are transformed by the opportunities that market agriculture offers them, and the relationship between this place and the city of Jerusalem.
What's the state of the site in 2015 or 2023? Because we see that the area is urbanized.
Yeah, this is prime piece of real estate in Jerusalem. It's hot property. In fact, the excavations before I joined them were led by the Israel Antiquities Authority in 2012 and 2013 as a salvage project, because they were building a high-rise, an apartment complex, and then a mall. And then they hit these well-preserved ruins of the medieval period. And we found that most of those ruins were actually Mamluk. There were stables and industrial facilities and housing and whatnot. At the end of their 2013 season, the salvage project came to an end, and that area was built over by construction. But before that happened, I was contacted in 2013 whether I would be interested in excavating the top of the hill where there were standing ruins of a dry stone complex, that is, architecture built without mortar. And its relationship to the Mamluk site at the bottom of the hill was unclear at the time. Well, when I was invited to take a look at the site, I was in the field at Hespan. That was our 2013 season in Jordan. And um, yes, of course, I was interested in anything Mamluk related, particularly since Jerusalem and Heshbon had such a close relationship in the 14th century. Hispanis went to Jerusalem court. Land was sold on both sides of the river. Their families had relationships. They used each other's markets. There was trade and travel between the two places. So I thought that was a wonderful opportunity. And when I visited the site, it was exactly that. It was an overgrown orchard. And unless even people living there didn't know that site was there, they were surprised that there was such an extensive, but small, but a very well preserved archaeological site right in the middle of their neighborhood. And from the beginning, we wanted to develop this place and save it as an archaeological site and protect it and to make sure that it wasn't built on top of and that it would remain a garden site for the people that live in the community and that its cultural heritage would be preserved for everybody for the future. And that vision, fortunately, has now come to fruition. This is the site since the last 2 months has been actively being restored and developed as an archaeological park. And the Ottoman component, which is the one that's standing above ground, will now possibly by spring be available for visitors with signage and everything for people to be able to see what the place looked like in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries.
Did you excavate the residential parts of that site?
Yeah, what's on top of the hill is primarily residential. What's at the bottom of the hill and was subject to salvage excavations is more industrial and storage. So that's where the stables and the, we think, granaries, metalworking facilities, perhaps even kilns for pottery were located. What's at the top of the hill are where people lived. The question is who lived there? Okay, so in the primarily the 14th and the 15th century, what we have on the top of the hill is the reoccupation of ruins that are likely Abbasid. So there was once some Abbasid presence, a monumental building with vaults and everything. And those ruins were revitalized, and somebody moved in that has a close relationship to the military. So what we found were lots of horseshoes, pieces of chainmail, iron daggers, and spear points with the tang attached, and pottery that have militarized inscriptions that, from my own research, I know is mostly related to military sites like castles, estates, sugar factories that were under state control, things like that. But the top of the hill was residential, and it's where people lived or somebody lived, whether that was an estate manager or it was temporarily lived in by a Mamluk officer. I think it was probably a combination of the two. We also have a domestic or household size press of some sort, likely for the production of dibs, but dibs of what? Is this a molasses of date? Is it or of some other kind of fruit? We're still finishing up the botanical and chemical analysis for publication. My suspicion is that it's date molasses. It's a date molasses press. And we have the facility for processing that and the storage spaces and living space. And then that place, after the Ottoman conquest, it stands empty for a while. Obviously, the Mamluk army had to leave, and that military presence is gone. The place is empty and abandoned for perhaps for a few decades. And at the very end of the 16th century, a farming family moved in, just a family of peasants. They reorganized the space, they revitalized the ruins, and they built quite a nice farmstead on the top of the hill.
Do you think that the farmstead was part of a state monopoly on producing certain crops or certain goods? We were talking in the past about the sugar monopoly in the Gor Safi and on the Dead Sea.
Hmm.
Do you think this farmstead was part of some kind of a state-run enterprise, or it was just a local production for the local needs?
Yeah, it's a good question. We played with the idea that the press was somehow related to sugar production because we do have molasses jars on site, but we're too far from the Ruhr. We're too far from the Jordan Valley, and there isn't any place that's nearby that is appropriate for sugar cultivation or has any evidence of sugar cultivation. We're just too far inland. In Jerusalem. So I think that the press that we've got is really for household consumption. But I do think that this was a military estate, but not a place connected to an agricultural monopoly. I think what we have is an iqta. I think that this is a residence and an estate related to an emir that held some kind of fief, an iqta, in the Jerusalem area. Now, who that was, and what rank he was, I haven't been able to pull out of the written sources. But what we do know is that Jerusalem was full of places like this at one time. These fortified residences on the tops of hills that were called qusur in the plural, were kind of like a castle. And over time, that kind of residence continued, but it had a different function and a different meaning. And these became the houses of tribal chiefs over the course of the Ottoman period, and they continued to live in these castles on the top of the hill with walls around them, and the slopes were all terraced. And that's exactly what we have at Khirbet Beit Mazmil too. So for the Mamluk period, I think we've got an amiral estate. We don't have evidence of a monopoly, but what we do have is a fully functioning and autonomous farming estate where they're making their own metal. It looks like they're making their own glass, so there's industrial activity, but I don't think it's for export. It's just too small. I think it's for their own needs, and they may be making their own weapons and things there. It's entirely possible.
What was the transition between Mamluk period and Ottoman period in the coastal parts of Palestine? Or, of course, we're talking about Bilad Sham, Greater Syria at that time.
Okay, so the historical background for the reoccupation of our little farmstead is this. After the Ottoman conquest, the Ottomans, interestingly enough, kept a lot of the Mamluk infrastructure in place. Of course, they replaced Mamluk officials, but the system of tax collection, the endowment system, the existing iqta system was transformed into an Ottoman version of the same. And so there's a lot of administrative continuity. And really the priority was to maintain the economic viability of the region after the conquest. And that was done successfully under Suleiman the Magnificent later in the century. And that was a time of prosperity in the region, particularly in the Jerusalem area. It was Suleiman that created the look and the feel of the old city in Jerusalem that we have today, the walled city, and did building there. And people did building in his name. And the villages around Jerusalem, like the village of Beit Mazmil, would have thrived as a result. So the 16th century was a time of prosperity. If we look at our site, Khirbet Beit Mazmil, we see a reoccupation in the late 16th century. The village, the Arab village of Beit Mazmil was located 1 kilometer south of our archaeological site. They're not the same place, but there's a relationship between the two. That village, we have the tax registers for that, and we have court records that span 300 years that describe that village. So it's relevant to our site too. And what we know is that what started off as a tiny place soon after the Ottoman conquest that only had 3 households, it increases tenfold by the end of the century. And its agriculture begins to diversify. So while it was mostly cereal production before, by the end of the century, we're venturing into more cultivation of orchards. And then in the following Ottoman century, in the 17th century, people here are really engaged in market agriculture of orchards, a wide variety of fruits. And there's active buying and selling of land. Some people make off very well. Other peasants end up impoverished and indebted because they're trying to gain access to credit to buy land and they're not able to pay the debt back. So, there's mixed blessings in it, but what we do see is that the 16th century, for a while, is a period of prosperity. And then we get into some troubled times in the late 17th and in the early 18th century because of politics and a rebellion against the Ottoman state at the turn of the 18th century.
Can we reconstruct or estimate? Can we estimate the number of people who lived in that area or who used that farmstead?
Okay, so we have to distinguish between the village of Beit Mazmil and the farmstead of Khirbet Beit Mazmil. And where I excavated is the Khirbet, so it's the farmstead itself. That's only really big enough. It's tiny. It's only big enough for a family. It's a family farmstead, and we can go on the basis of estimates of floor size and how big families were. But I don't think that. I mean, we're talking about a nuclear family of maybe 5 people. I don't think that there were more than that living there in the Ottoman period. In the Mamluk period, again, we're talking about an officer that may have lived there temporarily, his manager who lived there permanently, and some other officials, because everyone else was living in the village. Right, so there's a relationship of some sort that we haven't really fleshed out between the farmstead and the village itself. As far as the population of the village, we do have the tax registers, at least for the 16th century, the whole series of them, from the time of the Ottoman conquest to the turn of the 16th century, that do document numbers of households and numbers of bachelors, that is, single men. And we can kind of estimate population on that basis. But let's keep in mind that by the end of the 16th century, this region outside of Jerusalem was fairly heavily occupied. It's densely settled with villages. They're not very big villages, but they're very close together. And we have settlements that are not big enough to be called villages. I don't know if you want to call them hamlets or whatever, and isolated farmsteads, but they're all pretty close to one another. So in terms of, I don't think anyone has yet done full estimates of that. There have been studies of the tax registers, but from an archaeological perspective, we have to really, there's been a lot of excavation. We're learning a lot more about the late Mamluk and early Ottoman periods in the region. And right now we need to kind of pull all of that information together to get a picture of just how big, how many, and what the production was agriculturally. And this is research that I'm still doing and that I'm doing with a team of people that do botanical work and whatnot and modeling. So the work, even though the excavation is done, the study of agriculture and village life in the region continues.
Did you excavate objects at the site, and what kind of artifacts you found at the farmstead?
You would be underwhelmed. I mean, it's exactly what you'd expect to see in a farmstead. So it's farming implements. It's pretty coarse pottery. We do have imports. We have imports from Venice and the kinds of imports you get in Jerusalem. So this small place, both in the late Mamluk and the early Ottoman periods, was tied in very, very directly to the markets of Jerusalem. So whatever was available in Jerusalem was available there too. You're getting glazed wares from Europe and glazed wares from all over the Eastern Mediterranean. And of course, pipes, and there's tobacco smoking in pipe form and in nargila form. We've got those, we've got them plenty. There was a lot of smoking going on at this farmstead in the 16th and 17th centuries. We have everything you'd expect a family to have. We have babies' rattles. They're lovely. They're just little circular balls that have seeds in them, and they still rattle. They fit in the palm of your hand, and if you shake them, you can still hear the rattle. We have jewelry. We have actually quite a few coins. These are mangirs. They're very heavy copper coins, so it's the cheap, small change that you use in the marketplace when you're buying and selling stuff, when you buy your groceries or whatever. But the farmstead was part of a monetarized economy, and that's very clear. So those are the core sort of things we find. For the Ottoman period, for the late Mamluk, it's more of the same. The more interesting artifacts come from the bottom, the base of the hill, not the top. So it's where the storerooms were. And that's where you're getting the accoutrements of raising horses. You've got armament, pieces of chainmail, things like that. That's what we're getting at the bottom of the hill. On the top, it's very rural, what you'd expect from a self-sufficient farming household.
How agricultural estates changed its role in late 15th and early 16th century during the transition between Mamluk rule and Ottoman rule? Was that change drastical or more gradual?
I think it happens gradually because the agricultural markets of Jerusalem develop gradually, and a lot of that has to do with land becoming available for sale. So if most of the land is tied up in iqtas, in the Mamluk period, eventually more and more of this land is sold by the Mamluk state, is privatized, and a lot of that agricultural land then becomes endowed as part of religious endowments and tied up in religious endowments. So it is a form of privatization of land. So by the time you get to the Ottoman period, land is either part of estates owned or controlled by military officers, timars, or they're endowed. You have a lot of agricultural land tied up in endowments, or it's in private hands. And the land that's largely privatized are these orchards. And it's the orchards that are being bought and sold actively. So this is largely how agriculture changes. It goes from really heavy cultivation of cereals to more diversified cultivation that includes, fruits and vegetables, to an almost manic emphasis on garden agriculture because it's profitable by the time you get into the late 17th and 18th centuries.
How was the political situation in Greater Syria during 16th century? Was political situation stable and allowed authorities and population to flourish, or it was a little bit turbulent? I don't think that. I think that stability, which happened during first decades of Ottoman rule, contributed to the general prosperity of the region.
It did. I think, excuse me, for most of the 16th century, this is a stable, prosperous, safe period. Things change in the 17th century as different officials come to power, particularly in Jerusalem. Excuse me.
No problem.
The most important change is an effort in the later 17th century at centralization. So the Ottoman state feels that, particularly in the Jerusalem area, that this region has become a little too self-sufficient, a little too independent, and there's an effort to regain political control. And unfortunately, the officials that are put in and replace local officials, local sheikhs, the Ottoman officials have no local ties. They have no ties to the local population, and they double the tax rate. And eventually that leads in the early 18th century to a major rebellion against the Ottoman state that includes everybody. It actually includes Ottoman janissaries. It includes the clerics, the ulama of Jerusalem, so the intellectual and religious elite. It includes absentee landowners. It includes the peasants. So most of the peasants of the villages that surround Jerusalem are involved in this rebellion. Well, for about 2 years, the rebels control Jerusalem, and then the rebellion is put an end to rather violently, and people are executed, and there are repercussions and in the villages. And I think it's at this point, this has an impact on our little farmstead at Khirbet Beit Mazmil, because we do have a period of abandonment from the early 18th century then until the 19th. And I think it is as a result of the Ottoman backlash against this rebellion against Ottoman authority in Jerusalem. But until then, life is pretty good. When it falls apart is as a result of the centralization policies, for one, and then for two, the indebtedness of the Palestinian peasantry in the region. Gradually, it doesn't happen overnight, but it's gradually from the late 16th over the course of the 17th centuries. Cash is available. All right, so you can take out loans, and there's blessings to that, and there's curses to that too, with any kind of loan system. And in order to buy land, peasants see for the first time they've got an opportunity to buy an orchard. Wow, that's fantastic. And it may not even be right by your village. It might be at some distant. And if you can buy that village, then you can make some profit in Jerusalem. That's a great opportunity. But to get that cash, you have to take out a loan. And there were lots of options for this from the late 16th century. You could borrow money from the village sheikh. You could borrow money from clerics that ran endowments. You could take out a loan that was called a cash waqf, where you're not, it's kind of a legal loan that doesn't have interest on it, but still it's very, very hard to pay back. And some peasants were able to pay back their loans and others weren't. And so a couple of things happen is that we have a rise in the standard of living of some households, and others end up even more impoverished because of indebtedness. We see the same thing happen then in the Tanzimat period. Many, a few hundred years later, in the late 19th century, we can trace this as well in Jordan, in northern Jordan, where peasant indebtedness goes hand in hand with buying of land, because you're going to do what you need to do to get that loan to buy the land, and it may pay off or it may not. So there's really two periods of indebtedness in the countryside, both in Palestine and in Transjordan in the Ottoman period. And one is this 16th, late 16th and 17th century indebtedness at a time of great prosperity. And then the other is another period of great opportunity, the Tanzimat in the late 19th century. And I think, I don't know that anybody's ever done a systematic comparison of those two periods, but I think that it warrants it, because in terms of financial history and agricultural history, there are some similarities that could be investigated. Yeah.
I'm going to send you another link in a few minutes because the time is running out.
Okay.
And I have other questions.
Okay.
Actually, the territory of southern Levant was separated into Sanjak of Karak, Sanjak of Ajun, Sanjak of Jerusalem, which stretched all the way to Aqaba. How economically these regions were interconnected? Because these days, or in previous decades, we witnessed some kind of discontinuity and some kind of fragmentation of that area. While in the past, not only that they were part of the same political system or same political systems, but they collaborated and they were enabling people to travel from one place to another. They were allowing them to trade between East Bank, West Bank, Southern Syria, and Southern Palestine, so to say. What was the interconnectedness between these areas?
Well, I've spent most of my career focused on the Mamluk period, but in about the last decade, I've really been venturing more and more into Ottoman because the sites I excavate have this Ottoman component. And what's been interesting for me is to see the degree of continuity. You know, political systems change, but people don't. So if you've got family connections across the river, those family connections change. If you're used to doing buying and selling across the river, that's not going to change because you have a new sultan in power, unless he makes it impossible to continue to do so. And in comparing fiscal records and legal records of the two time periods, what I see is continuity. Let's say if you compare the 14th and the 16th of the 14th and the 17th centuries, we're seeing that people that live in Transjordan continue to make use of the courts in Jerusalem. They register buying and selling. They're registering their marriages there, even though there are courts, very small courts in Jordan, in what's today Jordan. People continue to use the larger Sharia court in Jerusalem. That's what they were used to doing. They often sued their neighbors. We know this, lots of legal suits in Salt and Kerek find their way into the Jerusalem courts. The marketplaces, we have descriptions of people going from, for example, from Jerusalem and Heshbon back and forth, and both of them had marketplaces. Both of them were market centers, no surprise. But that didn't mean that they didn't use each other's marketplaces. They did, and they brought even produce and animals back and forth across the river. So there were these administrative borders were not political borders, okay? And there was still this regular flow of people back and forth, buying and selling, marrying, divorcing, doing what one does in normal life, irrespective of what administrative borders are set up by the state.
What was the Waqf system during the last decades of Mamluk period?
The endowments, and these were primarily religious endowments, took over a large percentage of taxable properties, both in Egypt and in Syria. In fact, in a really, really fine study by a Cairo-based historian several years ago, it was demonstrated that up to 80% of the income producing properties in Cairo alone were tied up in endowments and not able to be taxed by the time of the Ottoman conquest. And I suspect that there was something similar happening in this region around Jerusalem too. We just have more and more state land, or land was being sold out of the Beit al-Mal, the imperial treasury, from the late 14th century because the state needed the money. And it sold off its own assets. And when it did, people who had access to cash bought up this land and quickly endowed it because that was a tax shelter, right? You endow it for a charitable purpose and it can't be taxed. The Ottomans, after the Ottoman conquest, realized that there's a problem here. While it is a lovely thing to donate property for charitable purposes, clearly it wasn't always the rationale why people did it. Was not always charity. It was also a tax shelter. So the Ottomans started to tax endowments, and that was it was probably a necessary move from a state perspective, but it was hotly debated, and there was a lot of legal debates about this among the ulama, who benefited from the endowment system because they were the managers. But the endowment system was one of the most important financial instruments of the late Mamluk and of the Ottoman periods for many reasons. It provided public services. It led to really for a while in the early Ottoman period, development of agricultural land. I mean, that's just a fact. That we have intensification of agriculture, building of terraces, revival of dead lands as a result of these endowments. So it had a good impact for a while in the countryside. It had a mixed impact in the cities on urban properties, but that's a different story. But a very important financial and legal institution, and it provided jobs, most importantly.
Of course,
Yeah.
we're talking about 15th century, which was some kind of a period of stabilization after the Black Death and Tamerlane invasion of the region in early 15th century. What was the impact of plague? Now we're going back 100 years or 150 years earlier. We're talking about the period between 1341 and 1382. What was the economic impact of Black Death in Mamluk Palestine, so to say?
You know, the demographic and economic fallout of the Great Plague, of the Black Death, has been more studied in Egypt than it has Bilad Hasham, because Cairo just attracts the lion's share of historical attention. That's understandable. We have estimates for Egypt of how many people could have possibly died, what impact that had on certain industries, what impact that had on property prices, on salaries. Wasn't all bad, actually. Salaries went up. Land became available. There were all sorts of mixed results from the plague, which was a deadly, deadly disease. And I think we should use that data from Egypt and say that something similar happened to Syria, even though our cities aren't, nothing compares to Cairo. That's the Dunya, it's the mother of the world. There's no city of that scale in the region, but still the processes would be somewhat similar. What I see as economic impact for the time period that I'm studying. So again, that's like you said, that's 150 years after the Black Death. I can't measure the Black Death because I don't really have I don't have a mid 14th century horizon that I can study, right? At least not from this site. But what I have is something a little bit later, and from a single farmstead, I can't tell you what kind of demographic decline had resulted in, and at what point we have recovery. We have to go to written sources, and then we've got to look at all of the archaeological data from the region to do that, and that work hasn't been done yet. It's something that I'm starting on now, and I think has some promise. My feeling is, though, that the Black Death, as far as isolated farmsteads and very, very small villages are concerned, it didn't have the impact that it did in the cities. And why would it? People aren't living so close together. I think what we end up getting is there's more of an impact in changes in markets than anything else, and the safety of the roads. Those are factors that have more of a staying power and the relationship with the imperial state than maybe pandemics. From an urban perspective, it's going to be a little bit different. Okay, so if you're looking at Damascus or Aleppo, that's an entirely different situation. But in a tiny little farmstead, no. I think that but by the time you get to the 15th century, what has impacted people's lives is their pocketbook and the safety of travel. And by the time you get to the 16th century, it's looking pretty good for a while.
Regarding the economic situation, how we can look the territory where that farmstead was located in terms of administrative rule? Who had which center had rule over that area of southern Levant? Cairo or Damascus?
Well, it was Damascus. It was Damascus.
So
So there was a governor of Jerusalem. So this farmstead would have been answerable to the governor. And whenever there were revolts against or any anger against either the Mamluk state or the Ottoman state, that anger was always issued against first the governor of Jerusalem, first and foremost.
yeah.
He's there. You can get to him. Damascus is a little further away, but the person that really has control and control over the governor of Jerusalem is the governor of the province of Damascus. Now, to what degree then Cairo in the Mamluk period and Istanbul in the Ottoman period trumps the autonomy of that governor in Damascus to make military decisions in Jerusalem, it differs from time to time and from ruler to ruler. But this region does fall under the authority of the governor of Damascus. Yeah.
What are your plans regarding the site? Are you planning to dig this year, or you're going to be busy analyzing objects and reports?
Okay, excavation ended in 2019, and the site is now in the hands of the people that are specialists in restoration to make sure the architecture stands. We reinforce walls, we put in pathways and signs, and develop the site as an archaeological park. So that's the status of the site right now. What I'm involved in is publishing the final volume that will come. That manuscript is supposed to be sent out this summer to Equinox. The title of the book is very, very long, but the short title is Life on the Farm. Life on the Farm.
Nice.
Medieval village of Jerusalem, Life on the Farm. And that's what it does, is it traces daily life, really from the early Islamic period, of which we have traces, into the early 20th century of this single farmstead and its evolving relationship with the city of Jerusalem. So right now, the house here is just cluttered. I'm looking at piles of paper all over the floor. So I'm in the midst of writing. But as far as fieldwork, yes, I'm doing fieldwork at a different site and a new project starting this spring that follows on the footsteps of what we've learned from our work at Khirbet Beit Mazmil. So research on peasant life in the Mamluk and Ottoman periods, it continues.
Are you planning to excavate at Tel Hisban this year, or Tel Hisban is a little bit neglected?
No, there's no neglect.
I'm just joking.
Part of those piles of paper on my floor are Hispan related. So we're in the heavy work of going through over 50 years of data for those excavations. Yes, I'm planning for a study season next year, and we will go back into the field after I have made progress on this volume. So Hispan is very much alive, but we got to publish, and we have a commitment to getting some parts of the publications out, and then we return.
Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to follow up with your research and with publications that you send from time to time and prepare from time to time. I was just reading some of your books these days, and maybe I'm going to use this site in the West Bank for some of my articles as well. I don't think it would be a problem.
Okay.
So we can disseminate information about the farmstead, about the economic transition between Mamluk period and Ottoman rule. Of course, we're going to coordinate regarding the feature article, and I'm sending you my regards. All the best in 2023.
Same here. It's always a pleasure talking with you.